and we see it in Europe as our market share grows quite nicely in Europe. Really, there's a great story with South African wine from a value point of view. If I move on to a little bit of the terroir, this is the view of the Simonsberg mountain range. So you'll see in the center of this image, there is a you can see all of our buildings here. These are all our where our winery is, and all of our administration, bottling, etc. run from. But you can see the estate is right on the mountainside, so that gives us a number of advantages. We have a number of different slopes, so west-facing, south-facing, and north-facing slopes. And as a result, we grow 12 different grape varietals on the estate, and they can all be quite well suited to where they need to be. And then we're farming from roughly about 600 feet up to about 1,600 feet. So we've got this wonderful elevation that we're working with, and that means on the same property we can successfully grow Sauvignon Blanc, but also Cabernet Sauvignon, for example. So there are big differences in daytime temperatures, nighttime temperatures. The difference between the day and the nighttime also changes on different sites. If you look at the mountain itself, you'll see on the top of the mountain is that gray, almost white rock on the top. That's all sandstone. So that's obviously quite poor soil. And then below that, you'll see the foothills are incredibly green and lush, and that's all decomposed granite. So we are farming on decomposed granite, and it tends to give our wines a bit more body, a bit more richness. They tend to have a bit more power as a result of being farmed on those fertile soils. The sandstone is important in the sense that when it rains, obviously it's very porous. So it's almost like a sponge, and you'll see on the mountain foothills we have this wonderful, all these valleys and these drainage sites. So most of the water that we use for irrigation comes from our own sources straight off the mountain. So it's absolutely beautiful, clean water. So we really are blessed with a multitude of sites, altitude that we can work with, plenty of water, and really great soil. So that's a bit of the focus there. Then we're looking east, so we're looking as if we're looking from Cape Town. If we look west, we are now looking down upon the town of Stellenbosch. So the town of Stellenbosch has a population of about 180,000. About 40,000 of that population is made up of the Stellenbosch University. So the town really does change when the university is in session. And it's also the focus, obviously, of the South African wine industry's research and development. So we quite plugged into a lot of those institutions and what they are focusing on in terms of the challenges we're facing now into the century. And then also, if we go right into the distance, you can see False Bay. So that is the ocean is probably about maybe about 15 miles away, but we have a direct line of sight with the ocean. So obviously that has a phenomenal impact on us. Very nice cool breezes blowing up during the day, keeping the vineyards cool. And then at nighttime, very good air drainage, so we don't have frost. And then obviously the ocean is a fantastic sink of heat. So we do not have these there's an element to the heating and cooling of naturally in the environment. So we don't also tend to have much hail as a result. So really a brilliant site, a prime site to farm in. And to give you a bit of perspective as well, Rustenburg, the size of Rustenburg is about 880 hectares. I think it's around about 2,000 acres. So those of you who love Bordeaux, you can fit Pomerol inside Rustenburg. That's the extent of the estate. 1/8 of the estate is planted to vineyard, and then half of the estate is mountain land. You would have seen in that previous slide, which is essentially conservation land. We don't farm that. We don't touch that. And then the rest of the estate, there's some pasture in the wetter areas, and then obviously we have just some slopes which are too steep, and other areas which we have reservoirs, dams, etc. in. Just a little bit about the family here. So we've got my father, my grandfather, and myself. So we farm another third generation in the business. And then just to show you a few more nice pictures of the estate and the different aspects that we are working in. So really, there's nothing homogeneous about what we're doing. Every single site is different. Every single slope is different. And I think this image that I'm on now really shows the soil phenomenally well. You can see it's quite red soil, quite dark soil. It's almost like a chocolate color. So it has a lot of iron and a lot of trace elements in the soil. And we tend to actually find we need to devigorate the vines. And that's why we do use generally permanent cover crops on these on most of our vines to keep them in balance. And then we have a lot of wonderful architecture, so Cape Dutch style buildings. So essentially Dutch farmhouse style architecture, but using the natural hardwoods and the natural building materials in the area. So for example, the roofs that you see, these brown gray roofs, are all made from a thatch which grows in swamplands, which you can harvest and use for the roofing. And then the gables are very classic of the Dutch era. But within these buildings, we obviously have modern facilities, a modern winery. We modernized the winery in 1997, and we've just done a big renovation again now. And these are just our vaulted our barrel cellars as well. So we've stored all of our barrels underground. And then here's just another beautiful aspect. So you can see we've just got all these different sites from north, south, and west facing. So really a lot of different aspects to grow different varietals on, and it's a very exciting place to farm. And then this is another view looking up on the mountainside, showing you all the different aspects that we do farm with. So that's a sort of rundown of where we are and our history, the topography, the terroir. At this point, I'm going to just pause and see if anyone has any questions, whether it's about the South African industry, our history, the geology, absolutely anything before we go on to the wines. If there's anyone who's got any questions, please fire away. Daniel asks if I can talk about the 5 soldiers. So I'm going to show you a picture of the 5 soldiers. So this is the 5 soldiers. They're essentially 5 stone pine trees. Here they are, standing over here. And they have been there for about 150 years. So these are the same pines that give you pine nuts, which you use in when you cook and that you can eat. So it's a fight between us and the squirrels as to who gets the pine nuts every year. But this particular site, the 5 Soldiers Chardonnay, you can see it's really high up, and it gets absolutely hammered by the wind. It's right at the end of the valley, and so we get a very low yielding crop from this particular vineyard. And we make the 5 Soldiers Chardonnay from this block. It's a tiny production, and it's a wine which we whole bunch press, barrel, ferment, and then stays for 15 months in barrel. We're going to be tasting the sort of the cousin of that wine when we taste the Stellenbosch Chardonnay. Stellenbosch Chardonnay is made in a similar style. It's just not a single site. So any other questions that anybody has before we move on? I'm going to wait a little bit to get that chat back. Stop sharing. Okay, no more questions. Oh wait, here we go. Great clone question. So we use a range of different clones, a combination of clones which are considered old South African clones, which many of them were just essentially bootlegged into the country, and we've given our own numbers to. Some of them have come from selections that have been made inside the country. So there are some clones which have been propagated in natural sports that have come from the country, and we do have some of our own clones. But in terms of old French clones, we see some of them, but we see a lot more of the newer clones, not a lot of the Entav INRA clones, the new cleaned up clones. They all tend to be virus free and in good health. And we generally find that, as it's not very romantic, but the new clones do produce better wines. They tend to be better wines, more expressive wines. The old clones, you tend to have issues in the reds with issues ripening tannins, uneven set, that can be difficult to farm, and they're quite finicky. They like certain sites, whereas the new clones we do find a little more robust. Obviously, everything's site specific, but we tend to find them a little more consistent. And obviously, the plant material being cleaned up is important. There's a lot of leaf roll virus in South Africa. That's probably our biggest affliction that we deal with in the vineyards, and so clean material is important. And from about the late 90s, we've been able to access clean material, and within a few years of a clone being released, we can get hold of it. So clonal material is not an issue. We have about 6 different vine nurseries that we have access to, and we personally use two different vine nurseries. So we also have a very big table grape industry in South Africa, which exports a lot of fruit mainly to Europe. So the nurseries are generally in a very good financial health, because the table grape industry has been very strong, and that's obviously helped the wine industry, because we've seen an influx of really interesting Mediterranean varietals coming in, alternative varietals, new clones, and new selections. And so obviously there's a big focus now on people planting more drought-resistant varietals, or climate change resistant varietals. So the nurseries have the scope to be able to experiment with that. Lovely question, thank you. Any more questions about that? We can always circle back if anyone has anything that they think of when we finish with the wines. We're about halfway through now, so I think it's a great time to start to talk about the wines, and then leave a bit of time for questioning. So the very first wine you're going to have is the Chenin Blanc. So South Africa and Chenin Blanc, obviously, it's one of the varietals which we're very well known for. Whenever I travel around the States, everyone talks about Steen. There are very few wines still in South Africa that are called Steen or have Steen on the label. Steen, or how we pronounce it, Steen, essentially means a stone. And the reason for that is that Chenin Blanc grows everywhere. It's almost like a weed. It can grow almost literally on stones. And it's phenomenally high cropping. As a young vine, you can really get phenomenally high yields, and it can ripen fruit sort of straight out of the starting blocks as a very young block, and give you lots of fruit as a result of it's just very fertile. We have a large portion of our vineyards planted to Chenin. I'd say it's just under 20% of the total national vineyard is Chenin. And the reason for that is it's a phenomenally versatile varietal. So you can produce dry wine, sweet wine, sparkling wines. It's fantastic to make a range of different styles, barrel fermented. It's really great. It ferments wild very, very well. You can make clean, crisp examples, of very oxidative examples. It's, people use it to make white port styles out of. People use it to lighten out tawny ports. I mean, it's just phenomenally versatile. So we've got a lot of old vine Chenin, a lot of bush vine Chenin as well. And it's a varietal that I think, a lot of people want to pigeonhole the new world into single varietals, for example. That makes sense. So New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, Australia Shiraz, Argentina Malbec. But South Africa's kind of been stuck between Chenin and Pinotage. Now, I think, not to get sidetracked, but Pinotage, the issue with Pinotage is that it's very difficult to find Pinotage that you can walk through from inexpensive pinotage all the way to great pinotage. There's a lot of poor examples at the cheaper end, but the very good pinotage, and the more you pay for pinotage, the better it gets. And there's some phenomenally good examples, but you've got to pay good money for it. Chenin Blanc, on the other hand, I feel you can go with a really, really cheap bottle, like a $6 bottle, right up to a $60 bottle, and they're all good wines for the money. So I really think Chenin is going to be one of the varietals that's going to become the real country's calling card, and one of the go-to varietals. Obviously, we produce a wide range of varietals, but I think to throw people one ball to catch and to understand about South Africa, Chenin is going to definitely be one of those varieties. The particular Chenin you have at the moment is from a block, or two blocks. They're in the just over 30 years old, around about late 20s, early 30s, Bushvine vineyards. These particular blocks are not on the estate. They border the estate. They're from one of our neighbors. And what we tend to find is these old vineyards throughout South Africa, which is now a lot of interest in, are still there because the farmers actually couldn't afford to replant the vineyards, so they just kept them in place and often supplied cooperatives and bulk producers with actually phenomenal fruit. So what's happened a few years ago is people started to pull out these old vines and started to want to modernize, trellis these blocks, or move away from these bushvine principles. So we essentially rescued these particular blocks and started originally making our straw wine, our sweet dessert wine from them. But then just made small bits and pieces of dry wine ready for almost for home consumption. And that's where this particular wine you have in your glass comes from. I believe it's from the 2018 vintage. Stand to be corrected, but I think it's 18. And 18 was the year that we started to come out of our drought. So the drought started in 2015 and started to ease. It was still drought conditions in 2018, but it started to ease in 2018. And so there's generally we found a wonderful concentration to the wines, like wonderful richness to the wines. They're quite young wines still, but just their colors starting to develop, and there's a really great richness to this wine, which I love. It gives you a lot of sort of pineapple, pear, stone fruit characters. And I think it's in a country where we produce a lot of Sauv Blanc. This is a lovely, different flavor profile. It's a little more food friendly. It's great on its own. And with this particular wine, we do find with the drought years, we tend to get slightly thicker skins in the grapes, and as a result, you do get a little more texture to it. So I think it's a wine you can enjoy on its own, but really quite a versatile wine to have with food. And it's not a very expensive wine. I think this is what, $13, $14. I stand to be corrected on that. But it's, for that money, you're getting a really, really nice versatile glass of wine. And the wine's 2 years old now. I really think it can probably do another few more years in the bottle, and it's just going to get more and more rich and complex. What is another thing that we do a little bit of is if we do find a little bit of botrytis in the vineyards, we actually keep that in the wines, and that's a practice that we're doing more and more in South Africa. That little bit of botrytis does give you, obviously you've got to be very careful you don't put too much in, but it gives you a little bit of a honeyed character to the wines, and it just gives the wines a little more complexity and richness. So it's a really fun wine to make. It's wonderful to work with these older vineyards and these bush vines. It's hell to pick. Your back speaks to you for the next week after we've picked that block. But it's almost like an adventure every time you lift up the branches or the shoots as to what's beneath in terms of the fruit, vine by vine. So a lot of fun, and I think you get a lot of complexity from the vines because they're growing on the ground, and because you have variable ripeness whenever you're picking. You do get you get some sun-drenched bunches, you get some shaded bunches, so you do really get a lovely diversity in terms of what you bring to the winery, and that's where the complexity starts off. Is that you've got this range of sugars and flavors and sun exposures. So really, bush vines are wonderful to deal with from that point of view, from purely a winemaking point of view. So that's the Shannon. What I'm going to do is just carry straight through all the wines. We've got another 25 minutes to go. So I want to finish the wines. We'll chat about, then we'll have some, I'll chat about them later when we have some questions. So the next wine we go on to is Chardonnay. So Chardonnay is really a varietal, which is a relative newcomer to South Africa. It's only really started to be planted in the late 1970s. So in about 1918, we had the establishment of the KWV, which was a government organization set up post-phylloxera to deal with the oversupply of wine that resulted as a result of overplanting and planting of the incorrect varietals post-phylloxera. So there was this massive surplus. The KWV came in. They set quotas. They also set what we could and couldn't plant. They distilled away any surpluses that occurred. And their grip stayed on the industry up until the late 80s, really, early 90s. But the KWV, obviously, over time, just became very bad for the industry because people were guaranteed prices, and as a result, there was no real focus on quality for a lot of producers. And we were one of the few estates that survived through that era and continued to make estate wines and quality wines. But to circle back to how this impacts Chardonnay, the KWV essentially blocked a lot of producers from planting Chardonnay in the 1970s when it first came into the country illegally and was in nurseries, because they said it was a varietal which was very susceptible to disease, quite a low-yielding varietal relative to, say, Colombard or Shannon or the sherry varieties, Palomino, etc. So a low yielder and not a good varietal to distill. So those are terrible reasons, but those are real reasons that they gave for not really allowing Chardonnay into the country. You know, forget about the fact that some of the greatest white wines in the world are made from Chardonnay. So what's happened is a lot of South African wine producers had worked overseas, obviously tasted amazing Chardonnay, worked with amazing Chardonnay, and people started to bring Chardonnay cuttings into the country illegally. My father worked in the late 70s in Sonoma, and before that had worked with a prominent viticulturalist in South Africa, and he was taught to take a selection from a block. So he took a selection just before he came home. He didn't come home with any clothes or any toiletries or anything in his bag. They were just vine cuttings. We popped these into a freezer at home to simulate a sort of a dormancy period, and then grafted these vines out onto a block right near our house, and made a bit of wine in our garage to sort of keep this on the down low. Very excitingly, we thought that original plant material had been lost, but the viticulturist that my father had worked with actually planted some of those selections on other farms. And about 3 or 4 years ago, we actually found the plant material again. And we are now, we've taken selections from that, and we're doing meristem cultures to get virus-free material. And so we will hopefully one day, in the next few years, actually get a virus-free selection of that original plant material that my father brought in, and we hope to do something with that. So that's a very interesting start to our association with Chardonnay. So we've technically been making Chardonnay longer than it's been made officially in the country, which is exciting. And I think that gives you a scope to make all the mistakes that people make with Chardonnay. So picking it too ripe, or over oaking it, or just not putting too much winemaking into the wine. And over time, we've sort of visited Burgundy a fair bit, sort of the great Chardonnay producers of Australia, particularly in Western Australia, and then also in Sonoma, visited a few wineries there, and sort of come to our house style, and that's the Stellenbosch Chardonnay that you have in your glass now. So this is all hand-picked fruit. All of our fruit is always only hand-picked. We whole bunch press this fruit, so it's very gentle extraction. We don't take a press fraction as a result. It's all natural free run as a result. We settle the juice overnight, and then we put it to barrel, and all of this fermentation is spontaneous. So there's no yeast additions. We are sourcing fruit from throughout the Stellenbosch region. About 60% is from the estate, and the rest is coming from various parts of the region. Some close to the ocean, which give us more acidity. Some are closer to the northern side of Stellenbosch, so they're much warmer and give us more richness and more fruit. Really, this is probably the biggest production we have throughout the estate. So it's a wine that I think is a crowd pleaser. If you like Chardonnay, there's something for everybody in this wine. Oak use here is all 300-liter barrels. About 20% is new, and we use two very different coopers. The one only bends their wood using steam, and the one only bends their wood using fire. So we get a really spicy element and a very subtle oaking from the water bent, steam bent wood, and then the fire bent wood gives you the classic smoky characters which you'd expect from that barrel. The wine spends roughly 12 months in oak, and during that time we do batonnage pretty much every 2 weeks. And if the barrels go through malo, great. We do aim for 100% malo, and we generally get 100% malo. We're not scared of malo. We generally are picking for higher acids, and we're looking for clones that are naturally fairly acidic clones, and that just gives us the acidity to last through the barrel fermentation process and the long barrel aging process, and then the malolactic process, all of which you're losing acid through those elements. And then finally, before you stabilize the wine for bottling, the same thing is happening there. And then when we move, on age-wise, these wines do obviously develop beautifully with age, and I think sometimes we're releasing them a bit too young, our Chardonnays. There was a question about the Five Soldiers. So the Five Soldiers is made in a similar style. It's obviously just one vineyard, so wild fermentation in barrel, full malo. There's more new wood in the Five Soldiers, and it's aged for about 15 months in total in barrel, so a little bit longer in barrel. And we tend to find those extra 3 months in barrel just give us a little more of a savory element to the wine. There's a little bit of controlled oxidation which occurs, and you don't have as much fruit. You have a little more texture, a little more complexity as a result there. So time is marching on. I'm going to carry on now to the rosé. So we have a very unusual rosé made out of Petit Verdot. The origins of this wine are really focused on being asked, or come from being asked by a British customer of ours for a rosé, but for something different. So we thought, well, everyone's trying to make the lightest, thinnest, most pale rosé. Let's do the exact opposite. Let's make something that's really full throttle. So this is made from probably one of the most colorful grapes probably one of the most tannic grapes you can use for making rosé. When we first made this wine, we treated it very similar to how we treat our white wines, and we gave it way too much skin contact, and the wines came out black. So the color that you're seeing in your glass now is from a very, very short amount of skin contact. So from the time we start crushing the grapes to the time that we switch off the press and we finish pressing, that's the only time that this wine gets on skins. There's no other maceration. So it's just a very, very colorful varietal, and really very generous with flavor, and really lovely and rounded. So it's a varietal that I think people wouldn't think of producing into rosé. There is one other example that we know of in Italy, of all places, but generally this is actually probably one of the few single varietal Petit Verdot rosés out there. There is a book that's been written by an MW called Elizabeth Gabay, and she actually has featured this wine in that book. So if any of you are rosé nuts and you want to read more about that, there is an entire book written about rosé, which is quite fascinating. The wine also, naturally being a tannic grape, we do get a lovely earthiness, a lovely richness, and almost a bit of a phenolic sort of tannic character to the wine. So we do leave a tiny little bit of residual sugar in this wine. It just helps balance out that texture and the power that you do see in the varietal. But I think a phenomenally versatile food wine. You can have this with barbecue, really lovely smoked meats. But really, I know in the States there's a competition between certain parts. There's more molasses, and some places there's more vinegar in the barbecue sauce. I know that it's everywhere I've traveled, everyone makes the best barbecue sauce, but everywhere I've traveled and we've had barbecue and we've had this rosé, it works. So it really can cut through those really strong flavors. So I know you're entering barbecue season, days getting longer, they're getting warmer. So this, I think, is going to be fantastic for that. And then we move on to the final wine, which is the John X Merriman. So John X. Merriman was an owner of the estate from about late 1800s up until his death in 1926. And he owned Rustenburg basically through the phylloxera era and post phylloxera. So during phylloxera, the insect destroyed about 95% of the vineyards in the country, and we lost all of our vineyards on Rustenburg. And Merriman was also a politician and really lobbied the government to replant the vineyards in the area. So if it wasn't for him, we probably wouldn't have as successful a wine culture or wine industry. And the longest street in our town in Stellenbosch is still Merriman Avenue. So sort of a bit of a local hero who saved the wine industry back then. And then obviously being an owner of the estate, it was a natural fit for us to name the estate blend after him. So this is a blend of all 5 Bordeaux red varietals. A lot of people say that great Bordeaux varietals or great Bordeaux wines are produced in areas which are you can only just ripen them, or they just ripen in time. They don't ripen too early or too late. So we tend to find that that's how we see our ripening windows through all these varietals. Every year the blend does change. It's about blending the best wine we can for that vintage. So some years they're more Merlot heavy, some are more Cabernet heavy. Some years we find things like the Petit Verdot are just so powerful we only need a small amount. Some years we find, the Malbec is very lush, or some years it lightens the wine out too much, or the Cab Franc is very expressive, or whatever the case is. So it's this wonderful opportunity to put together the best wine of the vintage, and that's very much what we take advantage of when we are blending this. It's kind of halfway between New World and Old World. It's often given to people, the Merriman blend's often given to people in MW exams or in tastings, because it has elements of both. We've got the riper fruit that you would see and you would expect from a warmer climate, but still really, really good structure, and some lovely savory elements to the wine. The 2015 vintage, which you have in front of you, is a really great vintage. It's probably one of the best vintages of the last decade, if not the best vintage of the last decade, or this decade at least. Sorry, the last decade. I'm not jumping around a bit here. And the reason being, it was just everything happened on time. There was no heat waves. There were no cold snaps throughout the entire vine's growing period. Everything was great. So ripening the grapes was easy, and the wines almost made themselves in the cellar. And then aging in oak, here we age each vineyard parcel on its own for 9 months, and then we will we will then blend the wine, and once blended, we age it for another 11 months. So 20 months in barrel in total, and about a third of the wood is new. It's all French oak that we use there. So really a great claret style wine. Very popular with European clients, people who are drinking a lot of claret, who are drinking a lot of Bordeaux, and are looking for a little more of that old world style, but with a bit more new world richness and a little more power that we do get here, just simply because of the extra sunshine. So that's it. We're 10 minutes to go. We've run through pretty much everything in terms of the wines and the history and the geography. So really over to everyone else to ask questions. There is no such thing as a stupid question when it comes to wine. So please do fire away and let me know if there's anything you would like some clarity on, or any questions, whether it's about South Africa, the industry here, anything to do with Rustenburg. Please, I'm happy to answer.
And please, everyone, feel free to unmute yourself to go ahead and give a question. You can shoot them in via chat, and I'm happy to ask those, or actually Murray is able to read those as well. Total production of the winery?
So total production is about 1 million bottles a year. So,
and how does that break down as far as production, as far as whites and reds?
I would say it's probably around about 55% red and rosé and about 45% white.
Okay.
But our markets do differ quite a bit. So in certain territories in Europe, people see us as a white wine house, and in South Africa, people almost don't know that we make white wine. So it really depends. which market segment we are working with.
So Alex got a question here. He's heard of the labels change slightly year to year.
Yes, they do. They do. That's correct. So if we I can just show you. If I go back to the presentation quickly, let me just quickly get out of here. Let's go back to that. Share the screen. Sorry. Let's see.
Putting you on the spot here with the picture there.
There we go. Hang on a second. I'm getting there. Oh, correct. Can everyone see?
Yep, we got.
So if we look at our logo, you'll see here in this particular one, the door is open on the house, on the label, and this is the actual Rustenburg Manor House. If you look at the labels of the sample bottles you've been sent, you'll see the door is probably closed. I'm not sure who did the artwork there, so they might have just copied a generic picture. But basically, the premise behind this is that it's a very old estate. It is family owned, and so it's difficult to often communicate. You know, you don't want the family to override the history that is the estate. You know, we've owned the estate for about 70 years, but that's 70 years out of over 300. So what we do on the label is we open and close the door on the label. Now, I've had to give tastings where I've spoken to a translator, and this gets completely lost in translation. But really, a closed door doesn't mean things are bad, stay away, there's been a bad change in the family. And an open door doesn't mean things are great, come in for a drink. It's just showing the change in the orientation of the door label. The door on the label is just to show there's been a change in the family. So, for example, when my grandmother passed away, we opened the door. And when I became a shareholder in the business and joined the family business as the third generation, we closed the door. So whenever there's a momentous occasion that impacts the business, we will change the orientation of the door. We haven't done so for a number of years now, so most of the labels that you see on your shelves will be closed doors. But keep an eye out, you see a new vintage, you might see a open door possibly, and you can drop us a line and we'll tell you what happened. So that's a lovely connection that we have without sort of being overbearing as a family and everything. A couple more questions. So that was Alec. Thank you. Daniel, is each cultivar grown in a separate row or are they interspersed? So everything, all our blocks are kept separate. We don't interplant. And we also separate clones just because they do ripen at different times. Some of the old vineyards that you'll walk into will be interplanted, but very, very few people interplant today. There are a few people who will plant, say, Viognier and Cellar together and then pick them together. But I mean, it's very, very small. But a good question. But you'll tend to find people back in the day did that, and the reason for that is that if a vine died, they would just put another vine into the place of the dead vine, and you ended up with this wonderful blend of many, many varietals in the same vineyard. But a nice question. Any other questions?
Well, Murray, I'm going to thank you very much for taking the time out of your early evening there in South Africa. And thank you very much for an outstanding presentation. Timing was perfect, 11:55. Dan did pop in with another question I'll let you answer. This is the first time I've had coconut on the nose of a Chardonnay. What do you do? What do you attribute that to?
So that coconut, sorry, can you hear me? Okay, because just showing that my audio is not working, but if you can hear me, then we'll carry on. So when you toast oak, you do get different elements from the interaction of the fire or the heat interacting with the natural flavor compounds in the wood, the lactones and the different elements. So that's something coming from the actual oak that we use. So more heavier toasted barrels, you will get that slightly more coconut character. You do actually see it in a lot of American oak barrels. Not that we use American oak in this wine. And you'll see it in bourbon as well. You'll see those coconut characters coming through. So it's a result of that chemistry between heat and the wood's natural sugars and the lignin in the wood, and how they interact will give you those elements.
Fantastic. Any other questions for Murray? Well, thank you very much again, sir, for joining us, and it was great. This tasting has been recorded and will be available as a link to everyone who joined.